Let's bring in former presidential candidate, Democrat Pete Buttigieg, who last week endorsed former Vice President Joe Biden for president. It's great to have you back on the show. So much to talk about in terms of politics with you. But I'd like to begin with the coronavirus and the president's response, even those tweets. I know you're not in the race, but I wonder if you might think there might be a better way to respond to this outbreak and what it would be at this point.
You know what I've been thinking about is when he got elected, I remember a lot of friends, conservative friends especially, who said, yeah, OK, he's not a great figure, he's not a great leader, but it doesn't matter that much. Basically saying it's hard to sink a ship. And I think this is one of those moments where we're reminded it really matters who the president of the United States is. Lives depend on the wisdom and judgment of the president. And there are certain things that no one else in the government can do to coordinate the response, to manage the issue, to convincingly reassure the American people. And we don't have that, and that is incredibly costly. It's costly medically, it's costly economically. You know, we are still absorbing the economic consequences of all of this. And I think you're right on the program to discuss the fact that a lot of the worst consequences are going to be for the people who are the most vulnerable, people who don't have sick leave or who have high deductible health insurance plans. Or think of a small business owner whose bank loan will only be repaid if they can count on a certain amount of revenue. People are less likely to go out. That's a brutal hit. These things require presidential leadership, and right now, America doesn't have it.
Mayor Pete, we obviously have some important races tomorrow. You've endorsed Joe Biden. There's been a good bit of back and forth from Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders suggesting that you and black voters across the Deep South were part of a cabal of billionaires and elites and influencers who were manipulating the process. Would you care to respond to Bernie Sanders, who said that you, as well as black voters across the Deep South, cracked under pressure?
I mean, look, black voters in the South sent a very clear message about their trust in Joe Biden. Let me also say this. You know, when you're a 37-year-old mayor of South Bend, Indiana, you do not run for president of the United States because you were invited to by the establishment. You know, this is a campaign that I'm very proud of, and I ended it when we looked at the math. And even though it's extraordinary what we were able to do, it was also clear there wasn't a path. The voters had spoken, and it was time to work in service of the goals that motivated me to run for president in the first place, which was to do everything I could to try to unify the country, unify the party, and above all, make sure we defeat Donald Trump. And those very same things that motivated me a year ago to step into the race for president motivated me a week ago to step out and to support Joe Biden.
I think that one of the things that has been offensive to a lot of us is to suggest black voters or everyone is listening to the establishment. And I've told Senator Sanders, in Vermont, you're the establishment. You're the senator and was mayor. I think that we can disagree without having to make people look disingenuous where they're going. You have been held accountable for police matters in your city, and you've dealt with that. Joe Biden, I've certainly put his feet to the fire about the crime bill and Anita Hill, and he's dealt with that and apologized. Sanders needs to also deal with, he voted for the crime bill, right, and he has to deal with, he voted. I don't know how you make Martin Luther King candidate out of a guy that voted 5 times against the Brady bill. Let's come clear with that. And I think that what was offensive to many of us is to cancel Mississippi, to act like black voters were establishment. My heart is what many of his issues, but you can't take us for granted and then call you and now Cory Booker's endorsed him and Kamala Harris establishment kind of figures when in fact you are ones that fought the establishment just like he does. And I think a lot of us would want to support that, but let's have a straight up honest conversation.
Yeah, and you know, part of what it means to listen to black voters is to listen to the message they send at the ballot box. And there was a very clear message, certainly, that was sent in South Carolina. And I think that has to be taken seriously by anybody who claims to be taking that relationship seriously. And I'm also puzzled by all of these process arguments that seem to go around the arguments over where the country ought to go, right? I mean, most folks that I met when I was campaigning for president weren't asking questions about the establishment. They were asking questions about their health care. They were asking questions about the economy. They were asking questions about racial justice and about America's role in the world. Shouldn't we be having a debate about that? Because that's what this is ultimately going to come down to.
I ask you this question. One of the things that we all started to focus on after Tuesday, when it became clear that this improbable thing had happened, Joe Biden with a lead in the delegate count, something no one expected to happen on Wednesday, even in the best case scenario, the campaign didn't expect it. We're sitting right now, according to the NBC News delegate tracker, we got the vice president with a 77 delegate lead. Over the course of this month, that lead is probably going to widen between Mississippi, Florida, Georgia. These are places where the vice president's likely, if the Super Tuesday patterns hold, to rack up a larger delegate lead. So now we get to the end of March. We've had Bernie Sanders in your debate in Las Vegas. He's the guy who said, doesn't matter, you don't have to get to a majority. You got to just have the plurality. Mr. Petard, Mr. Sanders, but he said that, right? How does the party try to, and all of the people who supported Joe Biden, how do you try to make Bernie Sanders, if you can, make him live up to those words? Because the reality is that we could find ourselves at the end of March where it's clear that Joe Biden is going to end with the most delegates. Isn't it, there should be some pressure that the party might want to apply to Senator Sanders to unify quickly and to train the party's fire on Donald Trump as early as possible?
Well, to me, at the end of the day, the party is voters. The party is people who view themselves as Democrats, or at least view themselves as in opposition to this president, coming together to decide who we want to put forward as the alternative. And I think the biggest thing we can do, it's not about all of these kind of process things. There's no room where people hash these things out. It's happening across the country. And I think what we're starting to see happen is voters who went any number of ways, especially when there were 25 of us running for president, really beginning to coalesce. Now, I do think we've got to look ahead to unity. And we have to remember, look, the differences between the candidates are real. They're serious. I was litigating some of them as a candidate. But also, there are light years between any of us in this party and what's going on in the White House now. And we have got to remember what we are up against. It's not each other.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.